Welcome, everyone. We'll just wait a moment for everyone's connections to kind of equalize here. Thank you all for waiting. A little bit of a delay getting started here, but looks like got quite a few folks joining us here. It looks like maybe we didn't have you all muted as you came in, so please, everyone, mute your line. Be aware that as you come in, you're not muted. So please go to the control panel and mute your line. Thank you. Those that may be still joining, please mute your line as you enter. We appreciate everyone being here today. My name is Matt Haubrick. I am the chair of the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, and I'm standing in for Matt Hardy today. As we're approaching the holidays, we've got a few folks taking some time off, and Matt is taking some much deserved time away. So I will kind of get us kicked off here, and then I'll also be part of the panel. So you may be tired of seeing me by the time we get done here today, but we'll try to keep it interesting. We're looking for a very engaging session here today. So to all of you on the line here today, I want to say this is our say welcome to this 60th webinar. That's a pretty amazing milestone, in my opinion, in the Federal Highway AASHTO Transportation Asset Management webinar series. Today's webinar is focused on TAM and resilience building. This is a topic of great importance to transportation agencies, given the impacts of climate change on our transportation infrastructure and the resilience-related requirements that are part of the recent bipartisan infrastructure law. We had a TAM peer exchange almost 2 weeks ago in Providence, Rhode Island, at the end of the AASHTO TPM Planning and Data Conference. And it's clear from that peer exchange that there's a wide variety of experience across agencies. The peer exchange highlighted that there is a lot more that we can all be doing, but there are good examples from lead agencies that can be shared. The presentations from the peer exchange are available on the TAM portal, and Connor will be putting a link on the Zoom chat. The summary report from the peer exchange will be shared with the TAM community via the TAM portal when it's completed. The portal also has all the information on this webinar series, including all past, present, and future, well, the future ones aren't out there yet, but the past and present ones are, and the future ones will be coming. Just visit tam-portal.com and click on events in the main menu, and that'll get you to all of the webinars recorded and also the invites to future webinars. Registration, I mean. You can register for upcoming webinars as they are announced, and you'll find archives there of all the previous webinars. Links to the video and slides from today's webinar will also be posted on the site. And if you have any suggestions on future webinar topics, you can submit them on the TAM portal or by using the webinar's chat feature today. We are planning to have a good Q&A session and dialogue as part of today's webinar. So please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's chat feature. So I'll be in Zoom. You should see the chat there towards the bottom next to the participant list, or the not too far from the mute and Zoom buttons. So please use that chat feature to submit any questions or comments that you'd like to. We will answer all the questions during the panel session at the end of the webinar. We're looking forward to your questions. That'll be a significant part of today's session. So now I'm going to turn it over to my friend Tasha Clemens for a welcome to you all on behalf of our co-sponsor, Federal Highway Administration. Tasha is unable to be with us in person, so she has pre-recorded her welcome. Oh, not hearing the audio.
Transportation Asset Management. Today, we will be talking about transportation asset management and resiliency building. This was the topic of the FHWA AASHTO TAM peer exchange that was held 10 days ago in Providence, Rhode Island. Peter Don, my co-worker, provided FHWA's work on this topic during the peer exchange. Some of the highlights from his presentation included announcing new NHR training that is available, titled Addressing Resiliency in Highway Project Development and Preliminary Design. In addition, he also mentioned a number of projects that FHWA is currently working on to advance resiliency. These projects are assessing flooded pavements, the effects of sea level rise, and the impacts of wildfires on pavements and other transportation hazards. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing the summary of the peer exchange and the dialogue from the peer exchange presenters. And I hope you brought your questions and comments for our panelists. While we at Federal Highway Administration must speak with care on these topics, I will also be happy to answer as many questions as I can. I think you'll enjoy today's presentations and discussions, and I hope we'll all learn a lot this afternoon. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of you on many more webinars to come. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Hayana Park of Cyclone Partners to share our agenda and objectives for today's webinar. Hayana, I turn it back over to you and cooperation.
All right, thank you, Tasha, in recording. All right, so let's cover our objectives for and the agenda for today and get right into the content part of the webinar. The purpose of the webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community, building working knowledge of key concepts and definitions relevant to resiliency building and TAM, and beginning to apply this knowledge in order to answer the following questions. What opportunities exist to strengthen resiliency at my agency using TAM? What benefits can my agency expect by strengthening practices related to resiliency? What are key insights from the panelists that I can bring back to my agency? We're hoping you'll use the webinar Q&A panel to share your questions for the panelists today. Because we're using Zoom, if you have a question and you want to ask it, when we get to the panelist portion, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question verbally rather than having to use the chat. But I think we'll use both, and I think that'll make it for an even more interesting webinar. All right, let's move on to the agenda slide. So for the agenda today, I will first go over the set of questions that was asked of all of the peer exchange participants. So I think as Matt Hobrook had mentioned earlier, today's session really is kind of a post peer exchange report out of the event in Providence, and so we did ask all of the participants for questions for people to answer. So I'm going to then give a quick summary of that. And then as has already been mentioned, we will change the format of the typical webinar where we ask a few presenters to actually present something. And then we usually end up with just a little bit of time or no time at all for dialogue. But we really wanted this to be more of a dialogue-based webinar. So then we're going to have three of our four presenters from the peer exchange be panelists who will talk about what they presented, but also talk to each other about their thoughts on resiliency and TAM and what was learned at the peer exchange, and then ask you all to join in and have a dialogue with the panelists as both by voice or by chat with your questions. And then we'll wrap up today's webinar. So let's move on to the question summary. So if you go to the next slide. So we had a peer exchange on December 8th and 9th, and in Providence, Rhode Island, at the tail end of the AASHTO committees on transportation performance management, planning, and data conference. And we had, I think, around 20 agencies represented at the Peer Exchange. And we had a fun session on Friday. We kicked off with a dinner, and we thought we were doing a kind of more serious group exercise, but it turned out I said that in the scenario of kind of imagining a kind of a vision for an optimal resiliency and TAM situation in your agency, I said, imagine no constraints, just think of good ideas. Well, that no constraints had everyone get really creative. So if in the future we're all together, whether it's at TRB or at another meeting, maybe we can show on our iPhones some of the videos that were taken with the pitches. All right, if we could go to the next slide. So the peer exchange purpose, was really to share. I mean, it's really a forum. The format is to share ideas, talk to each other, and it was clear from this peer exchange that people are at very different stages of maturity when it comes to this topic, which actually makes the gathering of people together, I think, way more valuable because oops, if you could go back to the purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so hearing each other and kind of getting an understanding of where people are, I think was valuable for everybody there. So some, probably felt like, oh, maybe I'm not the only one who's not very mature at all. As well as, oh, here's some good ideas that I can, take to my agency. And then what we did in the second part of the peer exchange was to talk about, what is it that we should be doing nationally as a group to advance resiliency and TAM forward. And so people talked about their ideas, and then we prioritized actions. Next. All right, so I'm just gonna, so we asked 4 questions, basically asking people to respond to questions on the kind of state of their resiliency practice related to TAM. And I think 13 agencies responded. And the summary report for the peer exchange will be, completed soon and will be posted on the TAM portal, and you'll be able to see some of the data, and I'll share a little bit of it with you. So in terms of, what risks are being considered as part of resiliency, there were quite a wide range of responses, which was, interesting. People are looking at resiliency differently depending on what part of the country you're from. If you're a coastal state versus a mountainous state versus, a desert, you have different kinds of risks that you're concerned with. Almost everybody did mention extreme weather and flooding as an issue. And then lots of kind of more unique risks were mentioned by different states, including ice melt, seismic, landslides, and geohazards, and cybersecurity. In terms of the assets that are being addressed through their resiliency effort, everyone did mention pavement, bridges, and culverts because of the weather issues. And then there were several states that are looking at other asset categories. And then we did ask about, how far are they along in their resiliency efforts? And this is where, if you had a continuum from haven't really started to we're up and running and it's been going for a while, there was the full range of kind of status reported. And so in terms of the response, Florida and Alaska had more mature programs that they reported on, and a couple of other states, expressed that they're just getting started. Next. And then, some of the we did ask a question about the challenges they had. And so both, resources clearly were challenges, both in terms of funding for resiliency, but a lot of people talked about staff time and staff kind of capability related to being able to do resiliency related work. And people talked a lot about the importance of improving this expertise. And then people mentioned the need for better metrics and guidance related to the topic. And then a couple of interesting examples. I mean, you'll be able to see that when you see all of them. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see just in terms of some of the interesting summaries, places like Connecticut and Delaware are setting up new units related to resilience in some form within their agencies. Agencies like Caltrans have been conducting vulnerability plans and kind of doing assessments. And you can see that a lot of the agencies are in some form of addressing the resiliency improvement plans. But what was interesting is that I think people are looking at it from different various lens on how they're doing it. Next. And the next ones are just more of what some of the states are doing in their responses. I'm not gonna go into this now. The slides will be up so you guys can look at that. So with that, I wanted to get to the main part of our webinar today. We had presentations during the peer exchange from William Johnson, Mike Johnson, and Matt Hobrecht, and the Tricia Stefanski from Minnesota was all right. So Tricia couldn't be here today, and Mike Johnson is actually at a California Transportation Commission meeting right now. So hopefully he may be able to join in the tail end. So we'll have Matt Hobrecht and William Johnson being on our panel to have a dialogue about the peer exchange and some of the issues that came up. So why don't we kind of pause the slides and have Matt and William kind of, put on your cameras, and let's start with each of you. Let's start with William, who is from Colorado DOT, and William is the Performance and Asset Management Branch Manager, and then Matt Hobrecht is the Transportation Asset Management Administrator at the Iowa Department of Transportation. But why don't we start with each of you kind of sharing who you are and your asset management kind of role, and then share a little bit about what you shared at the peer exchange. But then after that, you can ask, make comments about it. But I have a set of questions I can ask as well.
Kiana, before you jump
we have
into
a question in the chat. Yeah, I think Matt is referring to a question from Carlos. When was the survey sent, and is it too late to provide responses? Not sure if you received a response from Texas.
Yeah, so Texas didn't. I don't think Texas participated, but here I am going to put into the chat the questions. They're just 4 questions, and I'll put my email into the chat. And so anybody who's on the call who represents an agency, yeah, please respond and send me, and I can add that to the compilation. Okay, that'd be valuable.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, these questions were just part of the kind of advanced work on the peer exchange. So if your agency was involved in the peer exchange, you probably had a submission, but for those that maybe weren't able to attend or whatever, submissions would be valuable. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Sorry to interrupt you, Hannah.
No. So I think, Matt, why don't you start since you're on? Just
Okay.
introduce yourself and tell a little bit about what you presented, and then we'll go to William, and then we'll have Q&A
Sounds good.
and dialogue.
Yep. So yeah, thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm with the Iowa Department of Transportation. At Iowa DOT, I work in the Chief Operating Officer's office in a little unit called Organizational Improvement. So a lot of what I do is coordination activities. And so the things that we're doing related to resilience, I will say, I noticed there's a few other folks on the call here today who are the people who are really doing that work. I am involved in it and help support it and try to move things along, but we have some other experts who are much more deeply involved in our resilience work. We have I think some really great work happening related to our resilience working group, kind of looking cross-functionally at Iowa DOT at how we can support resilience of our transportation system overall. And so I'm really excited to share a few of those things that we've been working on. I did share some of those at the peer exchange, and certainly would be happy to talk about a few of those things. And then also, if you have specific questions, I'm sure my colleagues would be happy to help fill in some of the gaps in my knowledge. So I think that's a good introduction for me. Did you want me to talk a little bit, Hannah, right now about some of the things we're doing at Iowa DOT, or should I pass it over to William first and then come back to that? Oh, you're muted.
Feel free to talk all you want, Matt.
No, William, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll just go back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm William Johnson, and I work for the Colorado Department of Transportation. I am the Performance and Asset Management Branch Managers, probably one of the more descriptive titles, but it leaves out a few of the programmatic areas within my group. So besides performance management, besides asset management, I also have risk and resilience and economic analysis. I'd say one of the things that differentiates Colorado from many DOTs is that I'm sort of a single point of failure, or more so, I coalesce these different programmatic areas, especially when we're talking about, hey, how does asset management and resilience work within your organization? Well, it all works through me. Of course, I have a strong team behind me that's been doing this stuff for years, developing lots of tools. I'm a process person, so I've been framing those into an implementable process, which I'll probably talk about later. I'd say the biggest thing that I learned, besides that a lot of people who do asset management and resilience work have a great sense of humor, pointing back to Hyana's dinner workshop, is how much we really don't know about risk and resilience and asset management. And, I hope to point out a couple of things that I've since learned to see in definitions, as well as, what they can mean for a DOT.
Great. Hey, Connor, can you take the slides off so that we can see the speaker's thanks? And if you put it in speaker view, you'll be able to see the person who's speaking better. So Matt, why don't you share with us what you're doing in Iowa, and William, you can follow Matt, and then you can make comments about the peer exchange, but I will ask some questions.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Yeah. So probably many folks are familiar with the sort of map layout of the United States and can kind of picture Iowa, but we're basically in the center of the country, relatively flat farmland for the most part, and we are bordered on each side by a major river. We have the Mississippi River kind of forming the east coast of Iowa, if you will, and the Missouri River forming most of the west coast of Iowa. and we have major watersheds in between. So flooding is probably our main source of impact on the transportation system in terms of disruptions and probably the main area of focus for our resilience efforts. We don't have a tremendous amount of issues with mountainous terrain or coastal areas or whatever, but flooding is definitely something that we have experienced many times in Iowa and is a major focus for us. Because of the kind of history of Iowa, we do have a relatively dense transportation network. When Iowa was kind of laid out during the rationalist era in the early 1800s, and they laid it out with a grid system. So there's literally a grid superimposed across the whole state of Iowa. A number of other Midwestern states are kind of similar, but we have a road every mile. Most of those roads are gravel roads that are just serving a local population. However, we do have a sort of a grid system superimposed on top of that is our highway network, including our interstate network. And so no place in Iowa are you really that far away from a part of the primary highway system, either a highway route or an interstate route. In fact, we did some analysis once using GIS, and there may be only a few acres in Iowa that are more than 10 miles as the crow flies from from a major highway. And so we have a very dense network. And so resilience for us is really about looking at those watersheds and trying to understand what types of impacts we might have during flooding events, and trying to make sure our system can bounce back as quickly as possible if there is a flooding event, or be resistant to those events if they do occur. Of course, there are other issues that we are looking at, including cyber issues and so forth, that have also been a problem on the transportation network, especially as people are becoming more and more reliant on data to help them make decisions about how they want to move themselves and goods around the network. And so those are other issues that we are looking at. But kind of in a nutshell, if you focus on flooding, that covers a good 90% of, I would say, of what we do. Or I hope I'm not kind of overstating the case there. Hopefully one of my colleagues from Iowa will chime in if I have done so. But that is the major focus for us. And we've done quite a bit of analysis of our network, looking at where we do have watersheds, where we might have some particular issues with roads that might more readily overtop. Then how can we get those roads back to normal quickly? Typically the bridge itself would be fine, but it would be the adjoining roadway. And have we kind of hardened the shoulders, or are there other things that we can or should do that would make that roadway less likely to have issues that might take it out of service beyond the window of the flooding event itself? We've had a number of times when that has happened, when we've had a flooding event that then takes out a road that we have to go back and put it in, that leaves that out of service for a while. So those are the kinds of things that we're hoping to avoid. But we're also putting into our resilience efforts, actually resilience itself is part of an overarching effort of right sizing on our network. And so I think one of the things that we want to be very conscious of is to look at the overall mix of investments that we're making. And we want to make sure that our system is resilient, but we also want to make wise investment decisions about where to incorporate resilience initiatives, and so, or resilience treatments. And so the objective there is to look at our system and say, where are the places where not only do we have potential impact to our system, but where is that impact going to be substantial enough that it is worth the investment to harden that piece of infrastructure to prevent it from future damage. And so it's I wouldn't say that we've got that completely figured out yet, but it's definitely something that we have incorporated as a policy statement into our statewide long-range plan. And we are looking at that issue and trying to understand what is the right level of investment to make in order to keep our system resilient without over-investing in resilience to the point where we have put a lot of resources, money, and time into infrastructure that maybe doesn't really substantially benefit the overall resilience of our network as we think about it as a network.
William, do you want to kind of share a bit about what you're doing and what about your presentation?
Yeah, one thing that I did not cover in my presentation was a little bit of context setting like Matt did. So I'll give it here. In some respects, Colorado is perfectly average. We're average in population, average in GDP. In other respects, there's quite a few things that we're not average in. We're the 8th largest state, so it's a pretty sizable state. I always reference a recent AP article from last year where they were looking at the top 15 states with the most extreme weather. And I think if you travel a lot, you know that every state says, wait 5 minutes and you'll have different weather. Well, Colorado, out of those top 15 states, we're number 4. And you know, our terrain, especially being the 8th largest state, goes from flat to rolling to very mountainous pretty quickly. And yeah, we do have some very diverse climatology going on in Colorado, which causes some pretty extreme weather events. The other thing is that, so NOAA publishes this information on billion-dollar disasters. They have a new one for 2022, but I haven't read that yet because I'm giving webinars. But in 2021, there were $20 billion disasters. And out of that, 5 of them affected Colorado. So while we don't necessarily struggle with things like sea level rise, there are a lot of things going on in Colorado. The way that we've prioritized them is, well, we had a big flood event in 2013. And, you know, when we started really looking into resilience, when we had to use the new federal ER guidance at the time, where we were looking at, we can't just replace these bridges as they were in the past. We have to really look at doing some betterment activities. How do I prove that it's a solid investment if I'm going to be seeking ER funds? And through that, we developed a very robust approach to analyzing threats as well as risk and resilience. So, you know, in Colorado, we manage 12 assets under our formal asset management plan. You'll be seeing a new asset management plan from us hopefully next year. But out of those 12 assets, yeah, naturally things like pavement and bridge in there. We also have culverts. We also have geohazards. Geohazards is a formal program that we're managing here in Colorado. We have the highest interstate in the nation where your major threat is rockfall. And with that, it's like, what's your risk management strategy? Remove the mountain. And so we have to think of some out of the box sort of methods to really manage our threats. Now, that's on I-70. I-70 is $1 billion corridor in Colorado, $1 billion a year of economic benefit that it drives for the state. And it seems like once every 2 years, sometimes once every year, it gets closed down. And the detour route can be anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. So that's time and money. That's time in terms of the user cost. It's time in terms of the owner cost. Now, that's an important thing. A lot of things that we're doing recently in Colorado is we're looking at performance measures. If you've had the pleasure of reading through the bipartisan infrastructure law, you'll see something in there called annualized risk reduction. That's one of the measures that we're looking at in terms of when we use protect funding, how do we quantify annualized risk reduction? Ours is based on that user cost as well as owner cost. So we're doing stuff like that, trying to make improvements, as well as I'm going to post a link here in the chat. So you'll have an opportunity to go to it. That's our resilience page. We post all of our tools, our documents. We have a 303-page approach to risk and resilience on our website. Great reading, full of like words and numbers. You know, if you can't read the Christmas book to your kids, definitely read them. Our approach to risk and resilience, they'll love you for it. But also there's tutorials. So with our tools, you'll find a link to a video. Make sure to like and subscribe. And that will go through how to actually perform the analysis that we have identified there. Now, when we look at priorities, Colorado, I want to say that we started with, let's figure out what all the threats are in the state. And then we dialed it back and said, we're going to be working a long time and not necessarily do any analysis. We'll be doing a bunch of data collection and nothing to show for it. So we've prioritized on 5 natural threats. Again, natural threats, because looking at the bipartisan infrastructure law, it is heavily geared towards natural threats. Not to say that man-made threats such as cyber events and sabotage, I want to say one of the man-made threats that we had this weekend was an encampment caught fire underneath one of our bridges. Not to say that our approach doesn't account for it, but we're really looking at the things that are common for us. And those things are naturally flood, fire, post-fire debris flow, geohazard events, and something else I can't remember. Oh, snow. How could I forget snow? Which includes avalanche and blizzard. How could I forget snow? So again, we're not necessarily focused on sea level rise, but honestly, if you're an inland state, especially on the west, it seems like from one moment to the next, you're on fire. And when that happens, you're dealing with a 10 to 20-year risk management strategy. And our tools are geared towards helping them develop some interesting approaches to mitigate damage to our assets as well as damage to the level of service. I'd say probably the most impactful thing that I learned at the conference in Rhode Island was there's a difference between risk and resilience. Our asset management plans are heavily geared towards risk and risk management. And it wasn't really until the bipartisan infrastructure law that this thing called resilience and consideration of resilience and life cycle planning really came to be. Now, I'm going to give you a really generic definition for risk: positive or negative effects of uncertainty or variability upon agency objectives. Typically, when you're looking within the asset management plan, that's represented by your likelihood times your consequences. In Colorado, we also add vulnerability to it. And that vulnerability is sort of a thing that can change. It's an inverse measure where one means that you have strong things in place to make, to lessen the impact of your vulnerabilities. You have risk management strategies in place. You have a high design requirement on bridges and culverts that are mitigating some of the threats that you have. Whereas something like a 5 means that you just react. If something bad happens, stuff is going to get broken, and that's sort of what you deal with. But again, is when we're looking at that, especially in context of something in the TAM, like a risk register, we're able to do math on that. And we're able to see, based on reasonable alternative strategies, here's how your vulnerability and your risk score can change. The other thing is resiliency. What does that mean? The ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, or more successfully adapt to adverse events. There's a lot of gray area there with risk. And I'm not going to be the one to tell you I've got it all solved. I'm still trying to come to terms with that means, because honestly, from an asset management perspective and a performance management perspective, when I think of resiliency, based on that definition, it sounds like continuity of operations, that people know what to do, when to do it, what they're doing it for in case of an event, an adverse event, that people can still do things, they know who's doing what, and that we're able to maintain, to the best of our ability, the transportation services we provide. So when we're thinking about resilience in a life cycle plan, you should be scratching your head. What does that mean? I'd say part of it is, the or more successfully adapt. That absolutely is risk assessment. That's something bad happened. You're able to go through and you're able to assess it, figure out what your threats are, figure out what your strategies are, and learn going forward, figure out how to implement it. The other thing is how much do we know about who's doing what and how much should be documented in a TAM? So we have this other thing that's an optional plan within our, that's part of the bipartisan infrastructure plan. It's called the Resilience improvement plan. Again, it's optional, gives you the ability to leverage a 7% match reduction, which, in the case of your DOT, might not mean additional money, but it might mean that your more flexible dollars could be put towards other things. And that actually has a big benefit. But doing so, it is a resilience improvement plan. And when you're going through the shells, it really does talk to how are you going to approach this? What's your response going to be? And as asset managers, you may not be in your organization in the best position to respond to that. So I'm going to end there, Kiana. I'll let you answer some other questions. Sorry, Matt.
No, I think
I'm on a
that's
roll.
great. Yeah. Well, why don't we, I think there's are a bunch of questions to me related to this whole, how do you measure resilience, and what's the data source? What is there a standardization across agencies? Does it become a federal measure? But let's pause on that and first go to a comment that Josh O'Neill made on the chat, where Josh, do you want to chime in and just comment yourself? I could read it, but if you
Sure,
aren't
yeah,
able,
yeah, that's fine. Just, quickly, I was thinking of culverts.
Mhm.
We had a very impactful event here on the holiday, which was bad timing, on Labor Day, where we had probably one of the, I actually drove through it because I was picking up my wife at the airport when this was happening. This is the worst, most undrivable rain event I've ever encountered in my life. We had about 10 inches of rain fall in about 3 to 4 hours. And the culverts, particularly in Providence on Interstate 95, just weren't built for that to handle that kind of flow that rapidly. So this is, something I was thinking about, and not just our ability to bounce back from events, but that's not just the bridge design. It's not just roads and how close they are to a certain sea level rise level, but it's also the culverts and the ability to handle these really unprecedented events that are becoming more and more common, especially in the Northeast. If you look at some of the precipitation forecasts for climate change, the Northeast states are going to see some of the worst of these types of events, the short duration, heavy impact precipitation events. So it's just something else I wanted to mention because our weakness during that event was really the drainage culverts on the interstate. And that's a terribly difficult thing to fix very quickly.
Josh, are you from RIDOT?
No, I am Rhode Island MPO. So we are the
Okay.
only statewide MPO, Rhode Island Division of Statewide Planning. And I work very closely with my friend and colleague, Christos Xenofontos from RIDOT.
Mhm. Yeah. And in Rhode Island, do you have a culvert inventory? I mean, do you know how big the culverts are, and are you kind of thinking that you have to do an assessment of changes to culvert designs in order to meet the future?
Yeah, I'm sure we do. I'm less familiar with the culvert inventory. We have obviously two iterations now of the transportation asset management plan for the state. Latest one just got approved, and I've been reading through that this morning. We had a meeting where we were talking about our resilience improvement plan. We're beginning that process here in Rhode Island with a lot of great ideas and other studies to look at. But that's just one of those things where, as we look at our STIP projects, I think we need to raise the profile of some of the drainage investments and how those interact in this larger realm of thinking about resilience investments and resilience changes that we're programming within our STIP, at least in the short term. So I think maybe we need to think a little bit about, to the Colorado point there, about the all hazards risk assessment and how it impacts culverts and drainage.
I have
Go ahead.
something. First off, Josh, could we see the rest of the sweater? And
This is sorry, no, this is a Game of Thrones holiday sweater. It's the Tyrion
Oh,
Lannister.
I
if
hope
you're a
you were
Game of
wearing
Thrones
that when
fan.
you picked up your wife.
Yeah,
Um,
it's the I drink and I know things Game of Thrones quote.
Yeah, so culverts is an interesting thing. We focus a lot on culverts in Colorado. It is one of the besides, minor structures that we report to the feds. We do take care of culverts as a separate asset class within our asset management plan. I got to tell you, if it snowed 10 inches in Colorado in one day, you probably have to swim to get your wife to the airport. Our infrastructure just isn't built to handle that. But I think to some extent is debris flow. In and of itself, if there's a wildfire event and a normal rainstorm, it all of a sudden becomes, a pretty catastrophic event, or has the potential to become a catastrophic event pretty quickly. I'm put in the comment there, flow data has opportunities. Now, I want to say that most DOTs should be aware of stream stats. It's the USGS data on flow. We started using it in Colorado, and the more we use it, the more questions we had. And really, it was, hey, there's a lot of default information here that isn't really accurate enough based upon where we're identifying critical areas of concern, areas where we're seeing more periodic flooding that is above and beyond the thresholds that are in stream stats. And so we have to go through and basically update the data set to make more sense for Colorado. So that's one, a warning, two, an area of opportunity. I'm not in a position to really discredit stream stats across the nation. Maybe it's better for you where you're at than it is in Colorado. But I know Kiana asked the question, hey, is there a common data source that people use? Yeah, there are. Stream stats one, but you get what you pay for with some of these things. We don't pay for stream stats, by the way.
But so William, are you saying that by understanding the flow information, you're going to be better able to anticipate and accommodate these extreme? I mean, how does it solve what Josh described?
Yeah, for us, it really is the number one question is, I think on many people's mind is extreme weather events causing a change that is lasting? And that should translate to, do I need to update my design guides? Do I need to build for a much more heavier flow of water? So far, I haven't seen any data to make that determination, not just because of stream stats, but I just don't have enough information to understand that. So I think number one, that's the question, is if you have data that shows that you have heavier flow, more volume, yeah, for some of these areas, you need to make a determination of, I'm okay with losing that asset and that level of service, given an extreme weather event, or I can do something now. It's in poor condition. I could use the information I have within my asset management plan to begin to prioritize that and make some design changes to it to make it more robust.
So
So
it's
it
really
really
to
does get back
understand,
to,
right?
yeah, it gets back to
Yeah.
what are my investment options?
Yeah. But and to me, William kind of touched on this earlier, but there are kind of multiple levels of thinking about resilience here, because you do have that kind of immediate response, kind of that continuity of mobility, let's call it, for people to be able to continue to move on the system. And then there's kind of that response side. So in other words, if you do have an event, how quickly that maybe the event does cause a closure or causes some impact on the system to mobility, how quickly do we bounce back, right? So I mean, those sort of in my mind, two components of that. And what we got to think about when it comes to things, in my opinion, what we have to think about related to sort of stream kind of flow issues is the impacts that we're having to drain structures, are they permanent? In other words, are we getting them like washed out? Are they failing on us, and we get to the point where we have a major issue? Or is it just that they sort of don't have the capacity and we have maybe a short duration road closure or some issue impact on our system due to insufficient capacity? And then how quickly can we recover from that, or what are the impacts of that that issue. And I think, that kind of gets to the earlier comment I made about sort of right sizing. So maybe we do have an issue that a culvert is undersized, but we have to look at, what is the impact of that? What's it going to cost to bring that into up to a standard that would work? And then how frequently do we expect that type of event to occur so that we aren't over investing in resilience improvements? Because ultimately these resilience improvements are trade-offs that we have to make against investments in other things that we want to do on our system. And so we have to think very carefully about what is the right amount of investment to make. What are the duration of the impacts? How does that affect our system in a kind of complex way? And I don't know that we have a solution to that, but these are issues that we're kind of wrestling with.
All right, so Scott Anderson just shared this image, which I'll just put up right now. And he's asking you to react to, like, so Scott, do you want to just talk through what your interpretation and why you find this valuable? And then maybe Matt and William can respond.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so this is not my work, but I've used it, and I really like how it describes sort of like what Williams is saying. I mean, resilience means recognizing that something bad has happened and is going to happen in the future. And so what do we do about managing it? And it's not always robustness or redundancy or any of these things, but it can be. And so these charts here show different ways as time progresses on the x-axis, and then you have some kind of measure of performance on the y-axis, and there's a marching along until T1, and when the event happens, and there's things you can do to reduce how much your service is impacted, and things you can do to get out of that hole quickly. And all these different red arrows in this image show ways that you can do that. And it's I've always thought it was a very nice way as we try to wrap our heads around what are we doing with resilience. That's what intrigues me about this figure, and I was curious what the panelists thought about it.
Who wants to go?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it's a good illustration, and kind of think about the impacts on that y-axis and time on the x-axis. And I think it's kind of getting that point across. So, what can we do to decrease the amount of impact that we have? What can we do to decrease the amount of time it takes to bounce back, and how quickly we can bounce back? So I think those are all kind of illustrated by these figures, and that's a helpful way to kind of frame it as we think about how we can make impacts on our system.
Mhm.
My first thought was a little bit more hilarious. I see that you're using an Apple product, and I was thinking, man, if I have $1 for every pixel in that screenshot, I'd have $1. But hearing you talk it through, really the question that pops into my mind is understanding the nature of some of the things that we do at a DOT is it's systemic, and whether or not this is built into a process to make systemic decisions. Now, systemic doesn't necessarily mean you're only looking at the entire system. What it means is that you have a process that allows you the flexibility to consider things like this. So it really would be about, does your process like point people to this? And not as a requirement even, but even as a strong suggestion that they go through this in cases of events or in cases where it's good opportunity, that there's current condition deficiencies, and now they have to go through and make an investment decision. Does it point to this and say, hey, here's something else to consider for resiliency's sake. But, I agree with Matt. It's good. It's a great diagram.
Mhm, mhm. It reminds me kind of in the genre of the life cycle management diagram, where you see the area of the curve being less if you take action earlier, and the area kind of is equal to cost, that you can kind of make that analogy. I guess, the question on this one is the time dimension is, probably you would say that time saved equates to cost as well. But, the question is this: how are you measuring functionality, in terms of the performance, and what are the ways of doing that?
Yeah, that was a critical question and kind of came to my head, Kiana, is
Mhm,
thinking about the question you asked earlier about measuring the impacts.
mhm,
How do we measure, what is the measure of the reduced impact, and how are we thinking about time? And obviously there's a lot of estimation that has to happen, and a lot of sort of guesswork, right? I mean, about what the future might look like. So there's a lot of assumptions that sort of get baked into that, and I think it is really critical to kind of not just look at a particular bit of the infrastructure, but to think about it at the network level, right? To think about the network impacts of those issues. Are we have an event, is it going to have a broad impact across the system, or will it be relatively localized? And I think those are important considerations as we kind of think about measuring the impact of resilience investments. The amount of money that we invest in resilience versus the amount that we of benefit that we gain can't be isolated to that one piece of infrastructure. It really has to be we really have to think about the network and how things are moving on the network, in my opinion.
William, I know that at the Peer Exchange, a lot of people prioritize an action to try to better understand metrics for resilience. And I think we talked about it in the panel at the Peer Exchange, and you are already doing that in Colorado, where you are measuring resilience a la the way you're looking at it. Can you share a little bit more, specifics on how you're doing that?
Oh, you're wanting me to jump into that right now? I didn't talk about it, Yana. So I mentioned annualized risk reduction.
Mhm.
So that you can look at as sort of an outcome measure. That is, when you're investing those protect dollars, how are you doing it? Couple things to note about that is I had a chance to talk to a couple of my peers, and with that, there's states that have a specific project or a couple of specific projects that they're going to be spending their protect funds on. Yeah, there may be a close association with, do you have a coastline? And, based on sea level rise, do you have that road that gets flooded twice a day or every storm event? And then there's other states where they're pointing it towards existing projects. And in Colorado, that's kind of what we're doing. We have a project list. It's our 10-year plan. And we're pointing that to things that have good opportunities to start to manage some of our risk. That is, we've identified criticality on those roads. And through those roads, we've associated a specific threat or more than one threat based on those 5 priorities I had mentioned earlier. And through that, we can point people to say, hey, explain how you'd use these protect dollars using our tools. Now, our tools, again, are all geared towards that annualized risk reduction, which at its core is kind of like a benefit cost analysis. The other things that we look at is, are we delivering and spending the money on time? It's one thing to make an investment decision and to point dollars to a project, but are you delivering that project? And are you delivering things on time and maximizing the dollars towards it? So those are just 2 really generic ones that I'm willing to talk about at this moment in time, Hiana. I will say at TRB, I'll be talking more about resilient metrics that we're discussing in Colorado. We have about, half a dozen to 8 others that we're sort of tooling around with.
Great. Matt, do you have any thoughts on metrics?
Well, one thing we've done, I think that's been useful is we have done sort of a system level screening to try to look for where we think we have potential risks, particularly related to flooding. And so we have some smart folks in our planning group who have taken a look at some different approaches to screening our network. And we came up with one that was actually included in our long range plan that took a look at our entire network, sort of segmented it into chunks, and then looked at which segments of our system would be potentially eligible for resilience improvements, given the vulnerabilities that we've evaluated there, or the issues, I should say. Maybe the vulnerability is one aspect of that, but the issues that we've evaluated on that area. So it's not getting to the full kind of benefit cost analysis as much as kind of looking at our system and trying to think at the network level, where might we have issues and where would it make sense for us to be particularly paying attention to making investments in resilience as we're maybe thinking about a project in that area, right? So that's part of the long range plan guidance is, if we have a project in an area, these would be the kinds of improvements that might be warranted. Again, more engineering has to be done to kind of determine that, but at least it kind of puts it on the radar of the teams as they're putting those projects together to think about those types of improvements being potentially part of what they do. It's interesting because it did not highlight our entire network. We, as I mentioned before, we have a pretty mature system in terms of the amount of infrastructure that we have and our connectivity, and so there are some segments that were highlighted and others that we don't necessarily identify. Doesn't mean that there wouldn't necessarily be targeted resilience improvements in those other areas, but it does mean that that would not be at the forefront of the concerns that we might have in that particular area.
Well, it makes me think about your presentation, Matt, in terms of the right sizing issue. That was the topic that
Correct.
Matt presented on, and it's really gets to kind of the benefit cost calculation of, well, we can make, every infrastructure element really resilient and
Right.
overbuild, but that's at a cost. And so, what's the balancing of that cost to what you're building, and then you add in the user cost element that William was talking about.
Yeah.
We have a helpful comment from Maria in the chat. She highlights the Building Consensus on Resilience Metrics TRB workshop, Sunday, January 8th, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Time.
All right. Is that the workshop that, William, you're going to be presenting at?
Yeah, I'll be there
Okay.
right and early at TRB if you're
Okay.
going to make it.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
that early, 9 o'clock.
All right.
It's like 7 o'clock Denver time.
Uh-huh. Yeah, think about Hawaii time, what time
Right.
that's going to be.
Ooh, I try not to.
Let's Carlos Kale asked about incremental cost requirements. Carlos, do you want to just chime in and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so no, thanks for taking my question. This has been very helpful. So I work at the Texas Department of Transportation, and we're in the beginning phases of kicking off our statewide resiliency plan. And as part of that, we're gonna create a RIP, but we were seeing if maybe we could allocate some of those protect funds soon on existing projects, but we saw in the guidance, I don't have it in front of me, but basically protect funds, the formula funds, as the guidance says, can only pay for that that cost of the project that specifically addresses resiliency. And this is how I understand the guidance. So basically, if there's $100 million bridge project, let's say in Houston, we would have to show what part of that $100 million addresses a 500-year rain event or a hurricane event. And so we've been talking to FHWA about this, but I was curious to know if you guys had any thoughts about that incremental cost component of the protect guidance and how states can best navigate it. Because the way I see it is we're really going to have to focus on large projects, because trying to do this, let's say for a culvert project, may be a challenge administratively about quantifying that delta in between what the project, if we were just to build it to normal design standards, and then that increased mitigation, what does that look like? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the question makes sense. I think I'd have to say I'm probably not well positioned to give you a definitive answer to that, because I'm not deeply involved in our project delivery process in terms of how we would kind of segment out those costs. But I do think it's something that we should be talking about among the states about, sort of how does that look, and maybe a good topic for us to kind of bring into the AASHTO community to make sure we're talking about that. But by the way, you mentioned working on a resilience improvement plan, the RIP. There is a group, kind of an informal group that AASHTO is convening of the states who are kind of working to collaborate on those. And I'm not sure if TxDOT is a member of that or not, but we should make sure that we get the information out to anyone who is interested about getting involved in that group, and sharing information about work on the RIPs, as well as other issues related to the implementation of those protect funds.
Carlos, if you send any one of us your email, Matt can make sure you get added.
We will.
Will do. Thank you.
Yep.
William, do you have any response to Carlos's question?
Yeah, my response is I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot stick. Here's just my advice: is you really have to talk to your division office on a lot of these things. Much guidance and really approval authority is going to go through them. So, if you're familiar with other states' division offices, understand that, different division offices could give you slightly different answers. So that's more so why I don't necessarily have the best response to you, but what Matt said.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Kristen, do you want to share your comment with the panelists and the group?
Oh, sure, thanks. Yeah, just wanted to comment that I appreciated the graphic about the 4 R's of resilience. I do find as engineers, we often tend to focus on how are we going to build this stronger and better and more redundant. But there's equally important that concept of time and our agility, I might say, how quickly we can respond and how resourcefully to events that have not been entirely foreseen, shall we say. So coping with unforeseen events, I think, is important. And just having that in our minds, as well as what sort of innovative ways we can prepare to respond to things that we do not anticipate.
Thanks, Kristen. How about Ramon? Do you want to share your comment?
Sure, thank you very much for inviting me. Basically, when we're talking about performance measures and measuring them, one of the more obvious ones, see how many hours, days, weeks, whatever of work are going to be lost. But I would argue that in light of more and more of these resilience events occurring, that they might be changing the structure of the economy in ways that are perhaps foreseen or perhaps unforeseen, and that it should be taken into account using some kind of behavior model or economic model or whatever. I'd like to hear what the panelists may think about that, because I haven't seen it done anywhere. I think it's a place that should possibly be considered.
Mhm. Maybe almost like a system dynamics kind of view.
Well, honestly, there's a term for it that we're using now. There's probably two terms that you can use for it. One is community resilience. And, I think some of what you're talking about in your comment here, and just reading off this, how many people work in different industries, commerce, et cetera, besides just, the bottom dollar, the economic portion of it, you have to go back to how much do we know about communities, and more so, how much do we know about communities and the way that they use and value transportation options in times where they actually need it, not just on a regular basis, but also for things such as there's an emergency event. Water has to get to people, food has to get to people. People still have to go about and make money and pay bills. There's another term for it, which is called equity. And equity begins
I didn't want to raise that on purpose.
Instead I just
very delicate subject.
You got me on the hook. It's luring me out of the water there, Ramon. Equity, it's really, so first is, except when we're talking about equity, we're not talking about one demographic group. We're not talking about poor people or any given ethnicity. You're talking about understanding the differences of how transportation is used, and more so, once you have that understanding, using that understanding to make investment decisions. And I'm not going to say that a banker is less important than a farmer. However, the way that the system can be used, there are different needs, and there has to be an understanding there. I'm absolutely not saying that trade-offs need to be made. I'm saying more so, and I think, Ramon, this is your point, we need to have a better understanding of community and community equity to really bring into that resilience lens, so we understand that in an era where we're having more frequent events, we're going to expect things to go south quickly more often. And when that happens, are the people who only have one road available to them, are we investing in that road despite that it has low AADT, that it maybe has one or two trucks a day rolling down it? And otherwise, without considering those things, looks like a poor investment on paper. I agree with you, we're not there yet. And I'll admit that the way that Colorado is developing our first iteration of the RIP doesn't hit on community resilience or equity just yet. But I want to say that future versions of it will hit it a little bit harder. There's an opportunity there within the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's quite a few things that speak towards community resilience that can participate or work hand in hand with Protect formula funds or grant opportunities or MPO needs. It's just, we're not there yet. It's not mature enough for Colorado to take that step forward just yet. We know where our priorities are based upon our priority threats, but we're still getting that understanding of how those priority events affect communities.
Hey, let's go to John Andrews, who has two comments. Maybe you can ask both, since we're getting close to the end of our time.
Where I just had first, I think William touched on the data quality issue, and I wondered if we could expand on that a little bit in terms of the availability of data on current condition, on anticipated future conditions, and what the quality and the objectivity of the available databases are from which we can create metrics that will help us to make good decisions. And the other question that I wanted the panelists to comment on potentially was that we're focused on, we in this industry are focused primarily on the highway and its known assets, culverts, bridges, and pavements. But failure of these assets often involve also failure of other assets that are linked to our assets, such as electric power, such as water, such as sewer, that when our asset fails, it also impacts those assets. And is anybody working to coordinate that risk factor on top of the risk factor of just not being able to move vehicles up and down the road?
Do you want to, since I was so verbose on the previous one, Matt, it's all yours, dude.
Well, no, just I always have to add this caveat when you ask questions about data. So I'm trained as a statistician, and so this might sound a little surprising coming from somebody with a data background, but I think that we are talking about uncertain future events, and I'm not sure how much additional data is really going to help us. I mean, I think we need to understand the data that we currently have. We need to try to figure out what data do we need to help us support decisions, but keep in mind that these things are not deterministic. There isn't we're talking about complex processes here where we're trying to make predictions about future events and resilience impacts of those future events that are very difficult to predict. And it may be that we don't really need better data. We might just need sort of better models of the existing data, or we might need better analytics of those existing data. And so I kind of am of the mind of walking slowly when it comes to pointing to data collection as a big need, that I think we a lot of times aren't fully appreciating the data that maybe is already available or that we're already using, or really totally understanding the needs that we have for data before we launch into data collection. So I agree that we probably have some work to do on understanding the metrics that we need, and I'm sure data will end up being a component of that, but I want to have a holistic conversation about what our needs are before we get too deep into starting to identify additional data that really needs to, that we think needs to be collected, but maybe ultimately doesn't really move the needle on the analysis that we need to do to make the decisions. These are very complicated decisions. We're talking about resilience on our highway network, but I mean, I'm involved in helping to plan a workshop that's looking at a TRB workshop, looking at the resilience of our freight networks, right? And so that's a whole different component of resilience, thinking about supply chain disruptions and what's happening with ports and how can we make sure that people are able to get the stuff that they need. And if you look at the impact of those kind of much more as a global event versus the transportation impacts of often are much more localized and just a different animal in a lot of ways. So I think, this idea of resilience, we are very focused on it, rightly so, because of our role in supporting transportation infrastructure and kind of have that infrastructure focus. But it's not enough to just have resilient infrastructure. We need to think really globally about resilience as a topic, and how do we kind of make ourselves anti-fragile to not just events that disrupt transportation infrastructure, but interrupt the entire purpose of transportation, which is to connect people and goods to other people that need it. So,
William?
Yeah, just quickly. At the conference, I may have been cornered by a consultant talking about EVs and microgrids. And, I go into things thinking that everybody has good intentions. And, I think part of that question mentioned EVs. if anything we learned from the latest hurricane in Florida, is that those have a tendency to catch fire when they get wet. Not just salt water, but just general water. Water and those batteries just do not get along well, and you don't want people getting incinerated in their cars. So action plans for that. And do firefighters have the ability to put those out? And what is the role in the DOT in helping, firefighters, first responders understanding that, knowing that your DOT could be the first responder? Back on microgrids. Colorado is one of those states where we are building out a very robust EV network. And the question of microgrids came up, just because any given year, half the state can be on fire. And we still have quite a few above ground electric lines. So, when the power goes out, are we leaving people who drive EVs stranded? And my response to that was, well, if there's a fire and people are trying to get to microgrids, what happens if there's a fire and people are trying to get to gas stations? Likely you're not going to be standing around waiting to pump your gas as the fire is raging on. You're going to try to go as far as you can. And in that event, somebody will come by with some gas or pick you up and get you out. And really, it's, do we have the capability to have somebody who can give you a little extra power to get your car rolling or get you out? And it's more a testament towards maybe thinking outside of the box on some of these solutions isn't the best approach. We don't need to necessarily go out and build a bunch of microgrids. Maybe we just need to put some battery packs in some trucks in events where that happens. And Matt did such a great job talking. I'm going to stop there.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I mean, I think this is has been a great webinar, and thank you, Matt and William, for your overviews and responses. And thank you to all of the participants who weighed in and asked questions and made comments. I think that this has been great.
Hiana, is there still 5 minutes left?
Yeah, probably 3 minutes, because
Can I touch on that question that was just posted?
yeah.
Hey, what happens if equity could subsidize a wealthy community? My response to that is I would hope that people would use analysis for conscientious investment decisions. That is pursuing the most right thing. Another response is if that is the only road that they have to get to safety, it's not about building a luxurious road. It's about building a robust road, the road that meets their needs. And their life is just as valuable as any other person's life. I would say that it needs to be a consideration, not necessarily you need to actually make that investment decision.
Mhm.
It's something to think about, and you have to choose what that correct investment decision is going to be.
Great.
Thanks, William. And thanks, David, for the question.
Yeah.
All right, so Connor, if you want to put up the last slide. So we're going to be back on February 15th for our 61st webinar. And on January 18th, there'll be the TPM webinar. So we're kind of on every other month for TAM, and then on the other months for TPM. So every month on the third Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, there will be a webinar. The topic for that webinar hasn't been decided yet. So if you have ideas, please share them with us. You can email Matt Hardy, Matt Habrick, myself, or we'll probably, after the TAM committee meeting at TRB, kind of put our heads together and come up with a topic for the next webinar. So, but as was stated by Matt Hubbard at the beginning, you can always visit the AASHTO TAM portal, tam-portal.com, and you'll see the summary report from the peer exchange, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And you'll also see this webinar's recording which you can reflect on after this, after we're finished today. So thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.